So a little bit of a blast from the past with Update 2013. We did spend a lot of time. We had a 40-some-odd person finance caucus that spent many hours discussing how to even approach the topic of funding for statewide water resource investments. And three things that are quite noteworthy that came from those conversations I'm going to bring back into play here today, and they're being brought back into play for Update 2018 as well. And they really provide a solid foundation, and as we say here, it really laid the groundwork for the Update 2018 process. So the three things are: a framework emerged in order to frame our conversations and deliberations in water finance, and then shared values for state investment prioritization. This is huge, and actually there was very broad agreement on this, so we want to keep that on the forefront as well and remain mindful of that as we go forward developing the Update 2018 plan. And then attributes of funding deliberations, and I'll describe each of these somewhat briefly. Okay, I'm going to use an animation. It works about 75% of the time, so hopefully it'll work for us here today. So the point is here that we began our conversation with Update 2013 with a pretty fundamental question about funding for water management. How should we pay for things, and who should pay for them, and what are the best funding mechanisms? In response to that was a plethora of questions that one might see as tangential. However, that turned out to be very core questions, very legitimate questions that we really needed to speak to before getting down to the brass tacks of how we pay for things and who pays and who benefits. And so what we did is we developed this framework, these 8 items on the right, and that allowed us to organize our train of thought and our conversations. And we're carrying this forward as well in Update 2018, and I have it mapped out to illustrate how we're doing that, actually applying and advancing this finance planning framework. Speaking of which, this, I don't expect to pour over this, but just suffice it to say that the framework on the left is what was developed for Update 2013. The right-hand column illustrates how we're advancing each of those components. So we didn't array the information in the document 100% consistent with the framework, but again, rest assured that each of these components is represented in Update 2018. So shared values for state investment. I mentioned the significant consensus that occurred around these, and they are published in Update 2013. This is just kind of a sampling, and I would encourage you to revisit those as we engage going forward in the funding discussions. I think they will provide a significant set of, I guess, agreed upon guidelines for moving the conversation forward. So things like equal regard for what many of you may characterize as a three-legged stool. We have our 4 societal values that I talked about earlier this morning, which even broadens this a little bit more, for example. So I won't read through all of these because I do want to get into the panelist discussion. But just the takeaway message here really is that this set of guidelines exists. It's very much agreed upon, and it's a really good way to frame our conversations and deliberations going forward. Similarly, attributes for framing future deliberations. So things like methods for enhancing stewardship of state government monies. Can the state become a better steward of the public monies, and what are the ways that we can do that? I would argue that the sustainability outlook framework that I touched on earlier this morning in Chapter 2 of the document is a giant step in that direction, enabling us to demonstrate a return on state investment. So another just an example of the application of these pieces of Update 2013 that we're carrying forward. So jumping ahead to Update 2018 and the funding and implementation pieces. So we've identified historical expenditures, and that really helps us kind of frame where the money is being spent, where the activities are occurring for state, local, federal entities. And it also shows trends and a lot of interesting factoids that we could spend a half a day discussing, but we won't. I'll spare you. But this is really useful information for framing our conversations as well. Significant data on who's spending money where and how. We've also begun estimating investment needs. Obviously, that's a huge need to know going forward in terms of estimating what the costs are with implementing the water plan, and then the broader costs statewide for state government water management. So we've begun a process for estimating that. I'll just touch on that briefly here in a moment.
So we didn't put some of the funding slides into your PowerPoint, but they are in the document that people have in their hand. So where would they find that in the water plan draft?
Well, I have Chapter 4. There's some tables that break out the estimated needs to date. It's an ongoing effort, so I wouldn't consider it a final product yet. So Chapter 4, I don't have the exact page numbers. I do have a summary of them, though, in my slides.
Okay, so great. And there's the graphics as well. So he's
yes.
going fairly fast, but we just want you to know that in your hand, in the document, there are some really terrific graphics and tables and things that really speak to what he's talking about right now.
Mm-hmm. So upon estimating investment needs going forward, of course, then the next question is, what are the potential funding mechanisms that we have at our disposal to pay for this stuff? And again, we had earlier conversations on that. That's a topic of today's discussion as well. And I will mention that this includes existing mechanisms and then also potential new mechanisms. There's also a table. I think actually I do have the slide of that table in here, but it's also in Chapter 4, a summary of the attributes and applicability of funding mechanisms. And then findings, and I'll talk about that a little bit here in a moment. So some interesting factoids and takeaways from historical investment. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself here. This is total local, state, and federal expenditures from 2005 through 2015. And there's a lot of, as I said, interesting takeaways. One is really the proportioning of this with capital and ongoing are broken out. Capital and annual funding are broken out. And you can see the proportionality is quite interesting. When you overlay that with where policy discussions have been occurring or focused on over the last 10 years with general obligation bonds and so on, we really spend a lot of our time talking capital. We actually spend a lot of our money on ongoing, and that's where a significant need exists. So that's one of the key takeaways from this slide.
And then could you, this came up in one of our other discussions, but how do you define capital versus ongoing? What's the definition of that?
Thank you for the question. That's actually really important because capital is pretty intuitive. It's short-term, high-intensity investment for usually constructing things. Ongoing includes O&M. I describe it as it's the funding necessary to sustain benefits from past investments. I really want to hit home on the importance of ongoing and not understate how important that is in the water management picture. So ensuring that the past investments continue delivering investments, that can be O&M, for example, modernization, rehabilitation, consistent with one of our themes. But it can also be helping to ensure, increasing the probability that the future intended outcomes occur when we take future actions. That's things like planning and data and increasing the certainty that what we invest in going forward actually yields its intended benefits. So ensuring the certainty of benefits both in terms of what we've done in the past and going forward. This particular slide is the breakout of the capital expenditures, local, state, and federal. And again, I'm quick to point out, and it speaks for itself really, is the proportionality that's occurring here, with the federal obviously being the least of the three and relatively flat if you look at the trends. So not a huge amount of capital with respect to the entire IWM investment picture. State, somewhat significant, very variable. When you see the peak of the bonds, which tended to occur around the 2008 period, and then kind of the tailing off of state expenditures. That's part of the takeaway message. And then another big one is really the proportionality of local expenditures. This was a finding in Update 2013, and it continues to be the case today. 80 to 90% of expenditures are occurring at the local level. And so that really frames where our emphasis needs to be. It supports another one of our key themes, which is how do we better enable and build capacity at a regional level for these things to occur, because this is where all the action is. And so that realization helps inform our policy going forward. And there's just another couple observations here too in terms of the manner in which we invest. Oftentimes it tends to be in reaction to an event, oftentimes a catastrophic event. So for instance, Prop 1E not by coincidence, occurred shortly after Katrina. And then you can kind of see again how the bond expenditures peaked a few years later. The drought presumably played a role in the uptick in expenditures, particularly at a local level. You can kind of start seeing it on the statewide level. And then Proposition 1 is just kind of starting to pick, the tail end of this data set is just now starting to pick up some of the Prop 1 expenditures. I talked about that. So this is the ongoing expenditures, and again, driving home the point that particularly with state government funding, all capital all day, I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect, but look at where the needs are. Really at a local level with ongoing activities. And then we have to bring in the discussion of disadvantaged communities and their ability to maintain things that have been constructed in terms of ongoing expenditures, and also in terms of the planning necessary, even applying for grants, for example. So that's all reflected here in terms of where most of the need is versus arrayed by the different levels of government, local, state, and federal. So moving on to, this is just a really succinct summary of an ongoing estimate to characterize funding needs going forward. And really this is just I don't know, I might call it a data pull from local, state, and federal plans, this $165 billion for capital investment need. So this represents IRWMs, projects and IRWMs, other local entities, state companion plans, and federal activities as well. And again, it's a partial estimate, so I wouldn't hang my hat on that as being the high end of this estimate by any means yet. And then ongoing, significant as well, more than $1.2 billion per year for ongoing funding needs going forward statewide. This $1.2 billion, I'll point out, is characterized a little differently in that it's primarily state government estimated funding needs. So it doesn't pick up the local quite as much. That's a difficult thing to pick up, and we can talk about the details if we want to dive into this a little bit. But suffice it to say that this $1.2 billion mostly represents state government activities for ongoing funding needs. Getting right to the point of this particular water plan update, where we talked about the recommendations in Chapter 3, there's a significant chunk of capital here, and that's because a couple of the recommendations are really driving this. So one is a statewide infrastructure rehabilitation and modernization recommendation. So that accounts for a huge part of this, of both the capital and ongoing. That recommendation in Chapter 3 in particular. Of course, there's, I don't know, 30-ish total recommendations, but a handful of them account for the large part of these estimated funding needs.
And then just for those of you who don't live and breathe the water plan, so Chapter 1 is kind of the overview, setting the stage chapter. Chapter 2 is setting up the sustainability framework. Chapter 3 is the recommendations chapter. So when he's talking about Chapter 3, he's saying that you're going to see some big chunks of change inside of that. Chapter 4 talks about what are our options for paying for it, and that's kind of our focus for this session. And then Chapter 5 is how do we implement that.
Yes, thank you. And so this is an excerpt from Chapter 4. If in case you're not able to read it, the page numbers there at the bottom of the table, page 4-12, and it's in the draft document. But the point here is that we've identified potential new funding mechanisms and created a description, and also went through a bit of an analysis. And okay, what are the types of benefits of this type of potential new funding source or funding mechanism? And then what are some of the challenges or barriers to implementation or constraints, if you will, is what we've articulated in the last column. So really breaking it down for future consideration in terms of what we will end up recommending in Update 2018. Similarly, the appropriateness, as we've termed it, for these same funding mechanisms, how much does it vary? How much does it vary annually? I showed you that one chart where the bond funding had peaked and then kind of tapered off. That type of variability is what's articulated here, and that's significant for the funding streams, particularly for, again, those ongoing funding needs, which again, I'm quick to underscore their importance and not understate how important the O&M, deferred maintenance is a common response to the lack of ongoing funding. So I'm hitting that pretty hard in terms of its importance. Interannual variability is a significant consideration, particularly for ongoing funding needs. Applicability, what types of things can this fund? Is it a very narrow range of activities? Is it very broad and we can actually have some flexibility in terms of how this money is expended? So I'm just gonna end with two things for you to consider, two findings. There's more in Chapter 4, and this is still evolving, and the quantification behind these qualitative findings is still occurring. So bear that in mind. But for now, one of the key findings is really that annual historical funding, as we've quantified it, is not going to be sufficient to support future state actions or for the investment needed for statewide sustainability, and I framed that up for you this morning in our introductory comments. Let's see. So there's two messages here. Looking out over the next 50 years, and again, we're quantifying this, so we don't quite have the numbers just yet, but this is a no-brainer. We know that the numbers will illustrate this, and they are. They're not fully baked just yet, fully cooked. So significant increases in general funding. If we constrain ourselves to just existing funding mechanisms, and we want to do the things recommended in the water plan, plus the other ongoing activities like state local assistance at IRWM scale, significant increases in particularly state general funding and general obligation bonds going forward. Some of the preliminary estimates show that perhaps a doubling of the state general fund going forward over the next 50 years would be required. That's under one scenario where we implement a good chunk of all of the programs that I showed you earlier with that $165 billion price tag for the capital improvement and so on. And then similarly with the general obligation bond authorizations, it's looking like potentially under that scenario where we fund a good chunk of the future needs, potentially a doubling in the rate of bond authorizations annually than what we've seen over the last 10 years. So some key takeaways, some quantification coming, stay tuned. And what this is doing is setting up the conversation of what now? What types of strategies do we have at our disposal, and what are some of the considerations? So a little bit of a deep dive and unpacking some of the new mechanisms that we may have to turn to in the future. And I believe that concludes my presentation and the framing up of this conversation. I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Great, thank you. Did anybody have any specific questions about content? So questions of clarification or content questions rather than a sort of a question of just sort of or general comment? Yes. Let me come over, Charles, just so people can hear.
So the ongoing cost, does that include the regulatory process as well?
I believe it does. I would look to our team that actually compiled this information. I see Alan Highstreet shaking his head yes, so yes. Yeah. It was a data pull from several different state agencies, and the Water Board, I believe we have compiled that information.
Right. Yeah, and the general estimate, that's probably the number's probably low. And just based on what's been pulled so far.
Can I make one more point on context? This is important because a natural reaction, particularly if you're a local entity, a state entity, is, did you get my plan in here? And in some cases, the answer may be no for this water plan. We'll throw the net as wide as we can. We'll compile what we need or what we can, given the time and resources. In the scheme of things, it's not a huge impact for that we didn't look at every nook and cranny throughout the state, because the cost is so enormous anyway and the funding streams are so constrained. When we actually recommend funding streams for different types of water management activities like water supply, flood control, and so on, or flood management, whether we're shooting for 500 billion or 300 billion, we're going to be at 100 billion. Those are just sample numbers, so it's not absolutely essential that we capture everyone's plan. And then most importantly on the back end, what we're not doing is then recommending specific actions and specific plans that ultimately go forward. We're just planning at a very high level. We need to know the total price tag, and then roughly for different types of water management sectors, what types of investment or the magnitudes of investment that we think need to occur going forward. So it's really at a higher level probably than certainly at a local and regional level you typically would operate, but a necessary level in order to direct state funding for across the broad suite of integrated water management activities.
This is kind of the difference between a trillion and a zillion, basically. Just at a certain scale. Okay, Greg?
Can you just expand, Paul, on what you just described as the back end? When is that happening?
The recommendations for this water plan will be in terms of funding mechanisms and the quantities and the time frame is in Chapter 5. And so we'll lay out, for example, recommended or suggested opportunities for, let's say geo bonds at a particular point in time for a particular quantity for particular water sectors, so a rate across the water sector. And so as you can imagine, if we're talking billions, tens of billions, whatever, what have you, over the next 50 years, individual plans that are maybe not included in the total funding need, it won't really affect the total amount because the funding, the expenditures and the recommendations and the funding streams have a natural constraint regardless of whether it's a zillion or a billion or
Right.
Yes. Yes.
So that's on the funny, so that's the 90% that's still missing from the chapter.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Let's thank Paul for his session. So that sets the stage for the next part of the conversation, which is the state has identified an ongoing need for greater investment. That's the current, and this was a big finding from the last water plan, the current method of funding, which has been pretty variable, particularly at the state level, is not the most efficient or effective way to do it, and it precludes sustainable planning. So because of that, that leads the team to suggest that it would be important to figure out ways of stabilizing the funding and then augmenting the funding to get it to the level that it should be to meet the requirements that have been identified in the plan. So with that, all we have to do is figure out where to get the money from. And so some of the ideas that have been thrown out is taxes, levies, fees, different kinds of things. Yet that's not such a simple concept. There are a lot of constraints when we start talking about what any of these fund uses are for or how we should consider them. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Rachel, and I'm going to really take everybody back to your little program. Take a look at the bios. We've just got extraordinary speakers, and Rachel's one of the extraordinary speakers in this session, but certainly well qualified to be talking about this. And we asked her to actually spend a little time talking about the public policy considerations and what the legislature is going to look at as these kinds of proposals move forward.
Thank you so much. So I'm Rachel Ehlers. I work for the State Legislative Analyst's Office. We are the nonpartisan advisors to the legislature, the whole body, Senate and Assembly, Republicans and Democrats. And I think what I would like to do is broaden the conversation a little bit from not just what other options are there for state funding, and there needs to be an increase in state investment, but also thinking about the local side, because as we saw from the picture, the figure that Paul showed, the majority of investment right now is happening on the local side, and I would say, given the competing cost pressures at the state level and the volatility of the market and et cetera, expecting that 80%, 20%, whatever ratio it is to flip-flop is probably not a realistic expectation. So how can we look on both the state side and the local side for addressing some of these needs that have been, the stage has been set pretty clearly. So those are the, I'd like to talk about the public policy trade-offs for both the state side where I work, but also I think some of the same considerations are true at the local level. So first, I'm not going to talk about needs because I think that case has been met pretty clearly or laid out pretty clearly. I do want to talk just briefly about some of the constraints that we're living under in order to generate additional revenues. There are certainly constraints at the local level that I think probably many of you live and breathe every day. Proposition 218 is one of the big ones, which has imposed higher vote thresholds for approving certain types of new fees and pretty strict cost of service requirements for certain water-related activities. I'm not going to go into the details of Prop 218 because I hope if you're either too familiar with them already or...
Let's just do a quick check. How many people are too familiar with 218?
Yeah, so I think just globally, compared to historically before this initiative passed in 1996, it imposed additional requirements on the amount and types of revenue that local governments could raise and how close the nexus needs to be between those revenues and the types of activities that are being used. So a constraint. Also, another big constraint at the local level is limited resources in certain communities, particularly lower income communities, to even come up with funding to match state availability, state bond dollars, and certainly for ongoing operations and maintenance as well. Also constraints at the state level and federal level of just availability of funding, but also bonds being very variable, up and down, hard to count on them, typically only available for capital projects, and not ongoing operations and maintenance. And then similar to Prop 218 at the local level, we also have Proposition 26 that passed affecting state government and the types of ways that state government can raise funding and fees to implement state activities. Similar in concept in that the fees have to be very closely linked to the activity that they are supporting. Can't really be broad-based or else it's tax, and that has a higher vote requirement. So somewhat similar to the local level. So I'm not opining on the benefits or opposite of benefits of these two initiatives, just pointing out that they're the facts we're living with and they are constraints. But despite these constraints, there are plenty of options for generating additional revenue. They may have some hurdles, but they're not impossible. And so I wanted to just spend a few minutes going over some of the considerations that we had used, our office, when we advised the legislature. But again, I think they're also pertinent at the local level for thinking about what are some of the best options in certain cases. So I'm going to talk about 5 different key questions that we have advised the legislature as they're considering the most appropriate funding options for some of these types of water-related projects. And so the first of the 5 is, what is the problem we're trying to solve and what are the activities that we are trying to undertake? What's the cause of the problem to be addressed? Who are the responsible parties for this, or are there any for this problem? And what are the types of activities that we are planning to undertake to address the problem? So, for example, if it's a water quality or water pollution problem that we're trying to solve, there may be some pretty clear causes and responsible parties for that problem. That may lead you down one avenue of a type of revenue to generate to address that problem. And I'll talk about some of the specific types of fees or taxes that may be appropriate. But so anyway, the first one, what is the problem? What are the activities? And are there responsible parties? The second, beneficiaries. At what level would the benefits of these activities accrue? At the state level, at the regional level, the local level, the private level? And would these activities that we're undertaking or proposed to undertake result in broad public benefits or more limited, targeted, regional or private benefits? That would be an important consideration to think about in terms of what type of revenue we'd want to pursue. The third brings these two together, and what is the nexus between the activities and the funding source? So what entities would pay and at what rates? How closely linked can we get that funding source with the activities? So if we have a clear problem and a clear responsible party, that could be a pretty close nexus right? That in my mind would be a good example of where you could put in place a regulatory fee or tax for the cause of the polluter should pay for the project to clean up the pollution. If there's the beneficiary is very localized, if it's one region needs additional water supply, and putting in a recycled water plant would benefit that region, that's a pretty clear nexus, right? But there are other instances where the nexus may be more broad. If we've got the entire Sierra Nevada watershed and incredible problem with forest density, we know, well, who benefits from the water coming out of the Sierra Nevada? A lot of folks, right? The beneficiary ratio, does San Diego benefit? Yes, right? We know that because the water comes all the way down, but how are they the only beneficiaries? No. So I think looking at that nexus between activities and funding sources is important. The fourth is broad category that we look at is revenues in general, how much revenue needs to be generated and how stable or variable would those annual revenues be. So we've seen certainly during the drought that that one of the funding sources that water agencies have depended on is volumetric charges, which have proven to not be so stable during the drought as water use has gone down, but need to be to support the ongoing operations and maintenance. So thinking about the type of activity and do revenues need to be stable to support it? Is it a one-time activity, a capital activity that needs a big one-time investment and then could level off, or is it something that needs to be ongoing? How much funding is needed? I just had a conversation with someone in this room about a new fee to put in place, and the amount of the fee after doing all the math would generate a pretty small amount of revenue. Is it worth going through all of the process to put in place a brand new fee when the amount of funding that it would bring in wouldn't even support potentially the person that you need to hire to process all the paperwork for the fee? So thinking about how much money you need, whether you need it to be ongoing, and at what level. And then finally, the fifth consideration that we think is important is thinking about enactment and implementation. So what entities would need to be involved in approving this new option? Would it take place at the state level? Does it need the legislature? Does it need voters? Would it need to go to voters if it, for example, requires a constitutional change to redefine whether stormwater can be exempt from Prop 218, for example? Is it ratepayers who would need to pay? So what entity needs to approve it? What are the vote requirements for passage? Is it a majority vote at the local or state level, or 2/3? Those are important considerations. Thinking about what data would be needed to implement this new revenue option. For example, do you need water use data or the impacts of particular contaminants? Is that data even available before you design a new fee that you actually find out you can't implement or would be really complicated to implement? And then finally, how much latitude do you want over the type of revenue? For example, general fund, it has pretty broad parameters for how it can be used. Other types of fees are very limited, have to show the benefit to the ratepayer specifically. So again, I think there are a lot of options out here. Just even looking in the water plan draft, there's a dozen that are laid out here. So it's not that there aren't options out there, but they do have constraints, and I think really thinking carefully about how to define what are we doing, why are we doing it, who's benefiting from it, can really help lead down the path of which of those sources is most appropriate.
Great. And are there questions for Rachel before we move on? Okay, let me walk back.
Thanks. Hi, Rachel. Greg Zlotnick with San Juan Water District. Just curious if you might elaborate a little bit more in terms of your office or how you look at the Nexus discussion in terms of particularly the relationship of who's paying the fees to who's getting the benefits. Obviously, if there's a very close connection, that's one thing, but we've seen in the legislature in particular this past year, there's quite a potential, depending on who you talk to, divergence between who pays and who benefits for some investments that they like to see made statewide. So I'm just kind of curious if you can expand on that a little bit.
I mean, I'm not sure that our office has a a hard black and white line. I think it is something that when we're looking at analyzing policies and advising our bosses, we're generally trying to emphasize that there be a nexus, a beneficiary pays or responsible parties pays, or a public benefit issue. And if it's a broad public benefit, statewide benefit, then looking at options for more of a broad statewide investment. For example, general fund, state bonds, statewide sales tax. Those are the kind of broad-based public beneficiary. I know you're probably alluding to SB 623. I'm guessing. You know, that was sort of an interesting one, at least just from my perspective. We don't know
which number we will not say.
Yeah, the whisper bill. Whisper like groundwater. I mean, I think our office doesn't take position on bills, but in some ways that was interesting, and then it came at this from a couple of different angles, where it was having both a responsible party from the contaminator polluter side, and kind of a broad public, many public entities paying and beneficiaries kind of we're all in this together. So it came out from a couple different angles, which I thought was an interesting approach rather than trying to draw one correct arrow. So I guess kind of a roundabout answer, you know, we always bring it up and we always talk about it as an important consideration, but particularly for some of these broad public benefit type issues, sometimes the line isn't black and white, it's more gray.
Great. Anybody else? All right.
So I'm Dave Boland with the Association of California Water Agencies, and we represent the local government public water agencies, the big ones and the little ones, the north and the south ones, and ag as well as urban districts. And I guess just to kind of start things off, I'm anticipating a good conversational approach after I've gotten my remarks out about all the stuff that you guys have heard. We kind of set this up on purpose to get Paul to kind of set up, you know, what's in the current proposal and where that came from with the 2013 plan, and then Rachel to kind of give us the sort of governance superstructure tools, and then me, I'm kind of the guy with the crosshairs, I guess, you know, in terms of our industry being looked at as a potential deep pocket for paying a tax, a fee, whatever you want to call it, surcharges, whatever the terminology ends up being, to fund all this good stuff that's in the water plan and potential future water plans. And, you know, that's kind of a simplistic thing, and I'm being a little facetious, but
we have graphs. We have graphs that show that you guys spend all the money anyway.
Well, and yeah, there's a number of points I wanted to kind of get at, and that was one of them, actually. You know, they're, you know, kind of unpacking a little bit about what Paul did to set things up here in terms of what are we talking about spending money on, what do we currently do now, which, you know, the tools, and then how do we cast a vision for a future that we as a state, as taxpayers and citizens in California, regardless of our industries and our perspectives, how do we rally around, I guess, a vision for a water plan process and this idea of sustainability, and how do we get at paying for it? And I think that's the, you know, of course, what brought everybody into the conversation here is how do we pay for it? So rather than trying to find a silver bullet to figure out, you know, which button to push and to solve this problem, I think we really are going to have to drill down a little bit about what is it we're talking about, what is it we do now, and how successful is that, I guess, and that's an important question I want to raise, because the premise, I think, of the plan is that California is not sustainable, that we're just going to go off a cliff here if we don't do something really drastic. And we have some very drastic numbers and some ideas that somehow if we don't get this as cast in this draft plan, that we're just, you know, going to be in a essentially a meltdown kind of failed state mode. And I want to push back on that premise right off the bat. The fact that, and I say we, Californians, we are doing a lot of amazing things. We're spending an enormous amount of money on providing water and managing water and being good stewards of the resource. So to start out then, again, what is the universe of spending that's going on, and the fact that, you know, when you look at the trends and when you look at the way we've been spending money, a lot of it, again, is local spending. it's local water agencies, it's counties and cities and other kinds of special districts. But a lot of the action is at the local and regional level. And we are buying and managing, the assets and the resource, and we are guaranteeing a significant amount of stability and resiliency. Now, could we do better? Certainly. And there's a lot of opportunities that are pointed up in the plan for doing that. I think the big question is whether or not the current model can be sustained into the future successfully. And it was interesting to me, we had a somewhat similar session just before lunch here in the same room, and we had an impassioned plea to just stop at the bonds, because the bonds are causing us to not move to the next model, whatever that might be, maybe a benefit assessment sort of idea. And that's I guess a great perspective to have, is that bonds maybe have kept us dependent on somebody else's money. But when you look at the way the bonds are actually used and what they leverage, and the fact that so much of the actual spending is generated by locals and matched for those state bonds, and that they are targeted occasionally for different kinds of programs like flood or in this case, we have storage and Prop 1 or integrated regional water management, but that we are going through cycles and we do spend a lot of money, and that is a relatively successful model. And I guess I'll push back on, that's a premise here, is that's a relatively successful model. The GO bonds are not off the table anytime soon. They're an important tool. The other thing that's happening is that regionally and locally, agencies have been able to kind of connect this situation on Nexus. The idea that the Nexus really is important. It matters to the taxpayers and the ratepayers, and that in general, local governments have done a fairly good job, given a lot of pressure from case law, to make the case for their increases in charges and adding benefits, I guess, and making very clear what those benefits are and linking them to those rate increases. Now, they're not comfortable, and it's hard work, and it has to happen all the time. You have to kind of keep at it. You can't just let adjust your rates and just let it go. But there's a whole class of stuff that we're not paying for, and I guess I want to get back to the tables in the plan that identify lots of things that maybe are not being paid for at that local level with GO bonds. And some of those things are state government action, just the activities of the Department of Water Resources as it engages in the various water management responsibilities that are part of its purview, one of them being the water plan on a regular basis. Every 5 years, the water code says we need to revise the water plan, and that entire enterprise has been covered in some cases by bond money in the past, but in terms of what it produces, it is a value to the people of the state of California in general terms. And so we think that needs to continue, and we think that it needs to continue as a sort of a general funded sort of a benefit. There are a lot of benefits that the state provides in planning and administration that are properly general fund benefits that need to continue. Now, we know that that's hard to do politically, but that doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. The idea of taxes being sort of raised to address a general need of society and the willingness of society to pay those taxes is a fundamental way in which we govern ourselves. And we pay taxes for a lot of important purposes, and we can continue to do that. We have a capacity to do that. Fees, on the other hand, need to be linked to some kind of specific benefits. And so as we start to break down this project ahead of us, we need to think about what is it we're buying, and if it's capital projects, they can be locally funded, or they could be state funded, or they could be a matching, but there are resources for that. If it's O&M, it can be in your surcharges and your variable rates and so forth, your fixed rates in your water bill. If it's a general, I guess, duty of government, and the way I look at it is like driver's licenses, or there's a fee associated with that, but we know it doesn't support the whole enterprise. Fish and game, we expect wildlife to be managed in California, and we appreciate that, so we pay taxes for that. There are some hunting fees and fishing fees, but again, they don't pay for everything that we get. And so I guess what I would suggest is that if we look carefully at this big table of needs, and then we look at the other tables about tools, and we do a more rigorous job of matching how we pay for things now, and the fact that a lot of the stuff on the needs list does have funding sources and is being funded right now. Some of it's in the general fund right now. Some of it's in local government general funds. Some of it's in bonds. Some of it's in matching money. Some of it's in rates that the local governments have raised. And so, for instance, the Integrated Regional Water Management Plan model, many of those plans were used to populate this kind of data pool to analyze this kind of landscape of need. A lot of those projects and a lot of those costs to implement those integrated plans are already anticipated to be paid for. They are already funded in many ways, or they will be funded. We've got a bunch of Prop 1 money that hasn't been allocated yet. We have another bond that may or may not go forward, and it could make its contributions. So again, I think what we're calling for as an association, and local governments in general are calling for, is a little bit more rigor about connecting what is it we think we need with the case that we need to make to our ratepayers and taxpayers. And they aren't the same thing. That's the other point I want to kind of bring up, is the fact that urban water agencies have ratepayers that are pretty secure. They usually pay for their water, and you can get them on a regular basis monthly. That's not necessarily the appropriate subset of Californians to pay for all of these benefits that could be achieved by implementing a robust California water plan towards sustainability. All Californians generate benefit from investments in the watersheds, for instance, and forest management. And all Californians, many Californians, derive benefits from the flood protection and the dam safety and all the other kinds of things that are in that proposal. So again, I think the idea is to identify the beneficiaries. If you can make a case for fees, make that case. Trust the people to vote for those things. They do pay their bills generally. They stay hooked up to water. If we have a governance failure, if we are not able, for instance, in small communities to provide safe drinking water because we don't have the governance in place or the enforcement of existing health and safety regulations, then build that capacity. You know, that's a duty of government to do those things, is to provide the tools to protect the interests of the citizens. But to look for a subset of Californians, i.e. urban ratepayers, to add some unclear and potentially bottomless taxation liability onto their bills on a regular basis into the future to pay for good things for the rest of the state of California is just not fair public policy. And I think that is something that we're going to be engaged in, going forward on the water plan. There are obviously some very specific proposals that will be coming in the legislature. We do have a 2-year bill on the bill that shall not be named, that will be coming back here shortly. And I guess our premise has been that the water industry is not adverse to solving these problems. We just need to do it fairly and with respect for the ways in which we manage these mechanisms and tools now. And so I guess at that, I've kind of basically gone through all my points, and I'd be happy to kind of have more of a conversation here with folks in terms of questions or even provocative pushback. Thanks.
It's hard to imagine anybody in this room would ask something provocative.
No.
So let's open the floor to questions first, and then we'll go to discussion. So any questions? Let me come back to Charles. Or did you want to be provocative? Just hard to know where you're going to start. Okay.
So, Dave, I guess my first question is to you. Your boss has talked quite articulately about the world has changed in water. We used to just pay for water facilities, and now there's a whole ecosystem component to that.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's an equally important consideration. And so it's not just looking at, what past models of funding work, but that's an important change that we need to acknowledge, that the water industry may not have fully acknowledged yet. And I think it does change the funding structures going forward. So if you can elaborate on that thought and how you see that influencing funding structures, particularly as it relates to the water managers and water management, and how that might go forward.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot there. I guess I'd like to tag on to a shout out I got at lunch there about the public trust doctrine and just sort of here's Dave Boland here and he'll take care of the public trust doctrine and I took that as humor. But in fact
well, Michael's in back.
Yeah, Michael's in back. Grant is out and about now. But the point here is that this premise that we have the people's work to do, and that it isn't just limited to gray infrastructure from our grandfather's day, and that now we got to replace that too because it's getting old. But we've got this investment in the green infrastructure, the idea of the ecosystem and the responsibilities we have to manage these resources in perpetuity for sustainability in a responsible way. And again, we don't carry this burden as water managers per se. We carry this burden as citizens of California. We all carry this burden. And we put water managers in place to manage a resource, and that resource is linked to this larger enterprise of sustainability and ecosystem investment. But all hands need to be on deck on that, and that it isn't just the water industry that's going to solve all the ecosystem problems in California. However, that being said, a lot of those agencies have embraced that challenge. And the other mention that I wanted to give to Grant was during lunch. He mentioned the integrated regional water management model that Sonoma County Water Agency has been instrumental in leading for their region. Although I probably shouldn't have said that they're leading it because, like Lao Tzu said, the best leader is one who no one knows they're actually leading. And so that's probably the case there with Sonoma County. But in any case, they've got a dynamic thing happening up there where they've embraced a lot of truly integrated management values across a very diverse geographic area, and they've empowered a lot of decision makers to do really good things that involve the environment, they involve green, they involve gray infrastructure, they're doing the whole package, and they're also trying to figure out how to make it pay locally. They're not just got their hand out for state money, and none of the integrated regional water management groups have their hand out for state money per se. Well, as a matter of fact, some of them have shaken their heads about the cost of competing for that darn state money, when in fact, if they just spent the money on good projects, they might be better ahead. And there's been a lot of soul searching about that. And we are, struggling, in this same community, and as a matter of fact, in other parts of the building right now, on this issue of how to make integrated regional water management planning part of the enterprise. So I guess the very long answer here to your question is, you're right, ecosystem is part of the deal now. We get it. We've gotten it now for a while, I think. It's a question of making it happen. We are making it happen in some places better than others. We have plenty of great models for it. And it certainly has to be part of the enterprise and on the needs side, they've categorized the needs in general terms, and there's an ecosystem kind of category there that certainly needs to be on that list. One of the other areas, just again, kind of a stream of consciousness here response, is on investments in our watersheds and upper watershed management and headwaters, and that's again something that our industry has really embraced in a big way in the last little while, and really we do want to see increased investment in those forest lands, even though that's not our job necessarily. Water managers kind of nose their way into something here that, forestry management was not exactly what a lot of agencies were tasked to do in the first place. But we recognize the need for that kind of investment. And so certainly I think that the ecosystem investments are going to be part of the discussion.
Let's go back to Paul.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to provide a little bit of clarity. No provocation, just clarity at this point. But it's threading off of the whole public trust.
Go for it. Just go. It's not part of your character. Actually, go for it anyway.
I just wanted to clarify what we intend to frame up in the way of decision support for this water plan. Identifying the future funding needs associated with historically state-administered activities, and then again, that conversation going forward about what should the state be involved in and to what extent going forward. But categories, public trust is huge as a big category of future investment needs. disadvantaged communities, I mentioned that earlier. There's interregional and interstate activities that state government administers. And then there's the local assistance piece. And all of that will be identified in the funding gap that we will, to layman's terms, the funding gap that we'll be identifying going forward. Funding needs, I'll say that to not be provocative. There's also legacy impacts for which there is no responsible party. In general, in past discussions, that the state is on the hook to pay for that as a more broad public benefit in the absence of those that are, in the absence of anybody responsible for those legacy impacts. So framing it up that way and then identifying the funding needed, the funding mechanisms that can be used, and then having that discussion. Where do we go from here? Are there things that we think need to be forsaken in favor of not augmenting or stabilizing funding? Having that informed discussion, I think, is what's most useful, and that's what we're framing up in the way of decision support for this water plan.
Great, thank you. And I'm looking back at some of the our folks in the room that work in the flood sector. Another piece of this conversation that's been part of the driver on the funding plan and the ideas behind the funding plan has been, what is our tolerance for risk? And so there's sort of some trade-offs, and then where does that balance out? So there's some numbers being driven that are based on different risk calculations, that what was acceptable in previous times without so much population, maybe not so much now. So there's a little bit, with all the folks in here that work with 218, some of that sticker shock that comes from the idea of we've been really fortunate to live off of the investment of our grandfathers at this point in sort of the capital's now been expended. So there's a whole bunch of stuff on the table. The big questions, thank you, is great. I was making notes and man, you hit every one of them. The big takeaway from here is the water plan has identified that they do observe a gap, that there is a need for investment. The traditional ways, and Rachel described them really beautifully. She went through and made a list of, we're looking for a nexus, we're looking for a party, we're looking for this, and yet we have these issues that really don't fit in any of those buckets neatly. And Paul just kind of walked through those very carefully. The idea of the legacy, the idea of the those without a direct nexus like forest management, things like that. So what is the process for that when the traditional ways we think about the way we fund, how do we manage that? What is the method to bring it in? Dave makes a very compelling public policy case that when those benefits are truly general, then that really should be a general obligation. It's in the word general. So there's no easy answers. I'm going to give it back to Rachel to wrap it up.
I don't know that this is a wrap up. I guess I would just say encourage broadening the conversation. It's not just general fund, bond, and water charge. Those are not the only three funding sources available in the world, right? I mean, I also work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife that has a $20 million funding gap that we're trying to figure out how to solve, and they've gotten really creative about defining beneficiaries and thinking about public trust, but folks who are really involved in going out and enjoying the environment and the public lands that the Department of Fish and Wildlife manages, and could there be some way of those beneficiaries paying some people call it the REI tax or the binoculars tax, and that's getting discussed and debated. But I guess I'm just suggesting, which of course has trade-offs with it, but just suggesting to think more broadly and more creatively beyond just general fund bonds and no, there's going to be a bill on your water bill, and so Aqua's going to say no, forget it. You know, I think there's more than those three sources, and that's what. But some of the trade-offs and considerations I laid out, I think, can be a helpful guiding roadmap towards looking down to some other options.
Thank you. We literally have 10 minutes between now and the next session. So I see I saw a hand up. So where do we want to go? So I've seen a couple of hands up actually.
So I'll be brief since we're running out of time, but I just can't be in this session and not put Dave on the spot a little bit. And I appreciate that you're sitting there and willing to serve that role. So recognizing that we do have these unmet needs, I would push back a little bit on the notion that, well, everything's kind of okay as is. And that I know it's tough to be the deep pockets person. You feel like you're fending off all these fee proposals all the time. But I don't think we should talk about thousands of Californians not having access to safe drinking water in hushed tones is a thing that shall not be spoken. And people might not agree with the mechanisms that were put forward, but folks were trying to put something forward to solve that problem. And
so there's a question coming, right?
So the question is, how do we get innovative? How do we get creative? What do we do so that we don't just say, well, public benefits, general fund, and we all know that equals nothing's going to change?
I don't think it has to. I think that I'm going to challenge that presupposition right there. We're talking about doubling the general fund if we do business as usual. That's a shock. You know, that the citizens probably aren't going to put up with that. But on the other hand, at the margins, in terms of this drinking water challenge or other kinds of specific challenges, when a case can be made that this state needs to step up and do right by its citizens, that case can be made in a political context, and I think taxes can be increased. The general fund can be augmented to do that kind of work, and that's basically our premise. Is that again, being really specific about your question on that particular proposal, I think what we disagree about is the mechanism, not the ends. And I think, again, being a little bit more creative about what mechanisms or what species of mechanisms that we work on, I think is what's called for. And I think we're willing to do that. We want to do that going forward on that particular issue. But there's going to be a lot more issues like that, and that's what this planning exercise has identified for us, is that there's any number of needs, and some of them are more properly, in our mind at least, addressed through a general fund approach, and other ones are more properly addressed in a benefit assessment sort of approach, or flood and dam safety and those kinds of things. It's really clear who the beneficiaries are in many of those cases. So again, we're not saying no at all. What we're saying is let's use the right tools for the right to solve the specific problems in the right way.
So I'm just going to notice we actually have the next group is already starting to come in. Michael, can you make a comment rather than a question?
Yeah, this is
Okay.
really quick. One of the most encouraging things I've seen was the discussion at the State Water Board of supplemental environmental projects as a mechanism in settlement. And what I'm seeing there is if we can get on to the idea that in settlement you might find something that you couldn't work out before, so that we can actually start settling some of these things before they get to court, and then we don't have to have money going afterwards, but actually through the process going forwards. So I'm just sitting there with the administrative procedures at the state board, the Public Utilities Commission, the Air Resources Boards. If the settlements can be made, on environmental projects, that public benefits that would not ordinarily be done, that might surprise people.
Great. Thank you, Michael. So thank you, everyone. Can we thank this panel? Thank you.